If there's ever a name that can't be any more generic on the face of this earth for all men that walk on it, John Smith would be the absolute pinnacle of that in the English-speaking world. And for Disney, he would be the pinnacle of the most unmemorable character you have ever witnessed on screen. Because yes, I am talking about that John Smith from Pocahontas, voiced by Mel Gibson, who's based on the actual historical figure who played a role in the New World and the founding of Jamestown in Virginia. But like everything else about history, the Disney version is the most simplified and heroic one, positioned as the main lead alongside our title character and the eventual love interest in this film. But when you look at how Pocahontas is actually not a good Disney film, you understand that John Smith is a character that lacks any real reason to be a hero in this story. We've talked about this in detail a while back about Pocahontas and the films with John involved, but I think there needs to be a deeper understanding of why he sucks as a character, why he solely exists for one stupid reason and has not been developed beyond that point. And what we need to do is to know from real history is that he met Pocahontas when he was a captive and she was like 11 years old when he was a full adult, and how later she married John Rolfe instead. That history is not exactly developed to the point that the film makes and takes bits and pieces from it to make it into an epic. Remember, this film was pushed as a prestige project by Jeffrey Katzenberg over The Lion King, an attempt to make it something more like another Beauty and the Beast that could stun everyone and get that Oscar nomination for Best Picture. That goal required those romantic and epic elements with characters like him. But in effect, it created something so bland and so stark he basically became more like a vehicle in the plot than an actual person. He sure has this myth built around him, but it then gets broken down to the point where there's no real development after Colors of the Wind. Even more so when you look at Pocahontas 2, where they rectified this by making John Rolfe actually exist so Pocahontas can go with him, and then just allow Smith to exist as a character who could go wherever he wants. So today, let's just explore John Smith and why he's a terribly generic character. So when you start off right from the opening, John Smith is framed as a legend among men. Before we even see him do much, the crew is already talking about his amazing stories about him. During the storm, he jumps into action and saves the young Thomas from drowning in a classic competent hero moment that immediately positions him as the capable, experienced one. The other settlers just look up to him. He's the guy who's been out there, who's fought, who survived, where in the hierarchy of the Virginia Company expedition, Radcliffe is the greedy status-obsessed governor chasing golden titles, while Smith is the actual field man that the people like, the explorer, the soldier, and the one who knows how to handle himself in unknown territory. The film wants to see him as the dashing, adventurous leading man. He's handsome, skilled, and a little bit rebellious towards authority, and more interested in the thrill of discovery than in Radcliffe's gold-obsessed agenda, where he's meant to be the good Englishman, the one who isn't purely driven by greed and who will eventually be open enough to change when he meets Pocahontas, where in short, the movie is trying to build him as the classic heroic romantic lead, capable, charismatic, and destined to fall in love across cultural lines. That's the version of John Smith that he's trying to sell us in the first act. A man built in with a legend, respect from his peers, and a clear contrast against the villainous Radcliffe. On paper, he should work. But the problem is what happens after that introduction. And with that, contrast to how the film introduces Pocahontas before the two sides even meet. While Smith is being built up as the ship's legend, competent explorer through the eyes of other men, Pocahontas' side is given an actual internal life. We meet her as someone restless and searching. She's expected to marry Kocoum, the serious warrior her father has chosen, but she doesn't want that path. She dreams about a spinning arrow and change coming, where she talks with grandmother Willow and sings just around the river bend, openly questioning the life that's been planned for her and wonder what's waiting beyond the familiar. In a short amount of time, Pocahontas has desires, doubts, curiosity, and a spiritual connection to the world around her. She's already in conflict with the expectations placed around her, where she's active in her own story before John Smith even steps on shore. Smith, by comparison, is mostly defined by reputation and competence. We know he's good at what he does and what the man expects of him, but we don't really get a sense of what he wants beyond adventure and exploration in the broadest sense. His introduction is external. Other people talk about him performing heroic action, while hers is more internal. She's already a character with direction and tension, and he's still mostly a role waiting to be filled. This contrast matters because it sets up the imbalance that never really gets fixed. One character arrives with an inner life and the other arrives with a legend and just a handsome face. And when the settlers arrive and make landfall, John Smith is the one who pushes out to explore. While Radcliffe is already focused on digging for gold and establishing control, Smith is the first to move beyond the immediate settlement and into the woods. This is consistent with the legend that the film has built around him, the experienced explorer who wants to see what's out there rather than just to claim it. At this stage, his worldview is still pure colonial confidence. He talks about the land as something to be taken and improved, referring to the natives as savages, assuming that they are uncivilized people who will benefit from the English way of doing things. There's no real malice in the way that the film presents it, but there's also no curiosity yet and just simplified as it is. He sees the new world through the eyes and lens of discovery and ownership and not understanding. And then he crosses paths with Pocahontas. This first encounter is pure reaction. He aims his gun, she runs, and he pursues, and the tension breaks when they actually finally look at each other. From that moment, the film starts to shift into the role of the curious outsider. He becomes interested, starts asking questions, listens when she pushes back against his assumptions. And that shift is important because it's the closest thing Schiff gets to real character development. The confident explorer who spoke so casually about savages is now the man walking through the forest with her, trying to understand a different way of seeing the world, where the colors of the wind is built entirely around this change in the film. But even here, despite that, the limitation shows. He becomes curious, open, and receptive, but then just mostly remains there. The curiosity is real, but it doesn't turn into much more than quiet attentiveness. He exists in the scene as the man who's being taught, the man falling in love, and the man whose presence justifies the cultural exchange, but the film starts to settle into something more passive as a result. This is where the blandness really sets in. After Colors of the Wind, John Smith's role shifts from active explorer to passive observer who mostly exists in the middle of events. On the Southerner side, he's still the respected captain, but doesn't drive much. Radcliffe grows impatient and paranoid about the lack of gold, and the men remain restless. Smith tries to push back against the growing hostility towards the natives, but the film never really lets him take control of that situation. He's present for the tension, he voices some concern, but then the plot moves on without him changing the course of anything. Even when he sneaks away to meet Pocahontas again, it's reactive. He's responding to the escalating conflict rather than shaping it. And on her side, the dynamic is the same. They meet in secret, share a few quiet moments, and then the romance is declared. But Smith's contribution is mostly listening and being changed. He absorbs her worldview, falls in love, and just stands there looking conflicted, where the real decisions and emotional weight stay with Pocahontas. So when Kocoum attacks and Thomas kills him, Smith's main action is to take the blame so that Thomas can escape. It's selfless, but it's still passive. He's absorbing the consequences of other people's choices. From that point until his capture, he simply exists as a necessary piece in the middle. The settlers need someone important enough to justify a rescue mission and a march to war, where the Powhatan needs someone sentenced to death at sunrise so the conflict can reach its peak. Pocahontas in the middle needs someone to save her as big as him to stand for peace and a clear focus, where Smith fills all those roles without ever becoming the one who forces the story forward or who has any development of his own. He's no longer the legendary explorer the film introduced. He's a vehicle the plot rides on, the man who's just there for the colors of the wind, the man who gets captured, and the man whose presence makes the climax even possible. Everything just happens around him, but he never really develops because of that. And that brings us to the so-called romance, which is somehow even thinner than Smith's character arc. On paper, this is supposed to be the emotional core of the film, the forbidden love that makes the two worlds bridged apart and justifies the prestige tone that Katzenberg was chasing. In practice though, it barely exists as a relationship. They meet, he almost shoots her, they talk, they sing Colors of the Wind, kiss once, and the movie expects us to accept that this is deep, life-changing love. Look at any scene they share after their initial meeting. Pocahontas is doing the emotional and thematic work, and the rest of the leading, while he's falling behind. She's the one challenging his assumptions, explaining her world, questioning her own path, and later risking everything to stop the war for his sake. Smith's role in these moments is mostly to just stand there, look intense, listen, and occasionally say something agreeable. He becomes curious, softens, falls in love, but he rarely does anything that makes the connection feel mutual or earned. There's no real banter, no shared vulnerability that goes both ways, no sense that the two people enjoy each other's company beyond the symbolic weight that the story places on them. The film tells us they're in love because the plot requires it, not because we watch two characters who actually build something, and Pocahontas carries the entire emotional load of the relationship while Smith exists as the handsome object of it. And you can put him in contrast to the other Disney men and the lack of development becomes more obvious. Even in the classic Golden Age princess, the one we call blank or passive, had more functional agency in their stories than he does, where their personalities may be thin for their time, but within that logic of the fairy tale, they still do the decisive heroic action that the story requires. John Smith doesn't even do that. After his introduction and one song of growth, he spends the rest of the film being captured, nearly executed, and then shot while the other characters resolve the conflict around him. Then look at the men who came after him. Naveen in The Princess and the Frog starts as a selfish, spoiled prince who had to learn responsibility, hard work, and what it actually means to love someone. Flynn Rider in Tangled begins as a cocky thief and gradually drops the act, revealing vulnerability and choosing to become a better person. Both of them clearly have internal arcs, starting points pressure and changing to a different version of themselves by the end. Smiths get the outline of one, and then the film stops developing it. The change happens, the box is checked, and he settles back into being the handsome presence that the plot needs. And that's the real difference. The old princes might have been simple, but they still moved in their stories. The later ones were actually written as actual characters with flaws and growth, and John Smith sits in this awkward middle where he's supposed to be a modern romantic lead, yet ends with a mess and less agency than the fairy tale princess that came decades before him and had far less depth than the ones who came after. And even the animation works against him. Pocahontas was deliberately designed with more realistic intentions, angular and almost statuesque beauty, long clean lines, strong features, and less of the soft roundness you see in earlier Disney heroes. John Smith was drawn to match that aesthetic, where the problem is that same approach makes her look striking while he looks stiff. His face is handsome in a very controlled, idealized way, but doesn't move beyond that range. The expressions stay limited, determined, intense, even when he's listening to her, and pained when he's hurt. There's little emotion in the expressions he has compared to the other Disney men, where those like Prince Eric, for all his simplicity, has a more open, readable face, seeing his curiosity, awkwardness, and charm the way that the animators handled him. Naveen is full of elastic expressions, his arrogance, laziness, panic, and eventual sincerity that shows him in the clear animation. And even Flynn gets a constant undercurrent of swagger and sarcasm that lives in the eyes and their mouth. Their faces do some of the acting, but he doesn't. Smith's animation doesn't give him any of that. Because the film was chasing a more serious and realistic look to support its prestige and ambitions, he ends up just being rigidly handsome as the concept art itself. He looks the part of a dashing lead, but the face rarely tells you more than the dialogue already does. Once again, the presentation matches the character, clean, controlled, and strangely flat. But then there's the sequel. Pocahontas 2 is the direct-to-DVD follow-up that half corrects the historical problem that the first created. It finally brings in John Rolfe, the man Pocahontas actually married, and positions him as the new romantic lead. Smith is still around here, presumed dead at first, and then revealed to be alive, but his role is eventually just to show up, create a brief love triangle tension, and then gracefully step aside. The send-off here is just almost comically clean. After everything that happened to him in the first film, the big emotional climax, the wound, the farewell off the cliff, the sense that love was meaningful, Smith looks at Pocahontas and Rolfe and just accepts that she's chosen the other man and decides he's going to go off and keep exploring. No real fallout, no lasting weight, and just a polite exit so the historically accurate husband can actually take over. And that choice quietly undercuts the entire original film. If the first film's romance was supposed to be this profound, life-changing connection that stopped a war, the sequel treats it as a temporary phase that Smith can walk away from his life without any much trouble. He exists in the second movie just to mostly appear, acknowledge the new status quo, and leave. The big emotional ending of the original suddenly feels a lot less permanent when the next film can simply easily move past it. And so in result, the sequel seems to understand what the first movie never fully admitted. John Smith was never the point. He was a vehicle that got the story where it needed to go, and once that job was done, he could be written out with a smile and a wave. And in the end, he never had any agency or internal development that the stronger Disney leads get. He doesn't drive the story forward on his own terms and doesn't wrestle with the meaningful choices of change in who he is beyond one required lesson about respect and understanding. After that lesson is delivered in The Colors of the Wind, the film has little left for him to do except stand there in the right places, get captured, take a bullet, and look noble while the other people resolve the actual conflict. He exists for one clear purpose, so Pocahontas could have romantic connection on the other side of the cultural divide. This relationship just simply gave the film its prestige romance, its emotional hook, and the justification for a big stand at the climax. Once those boxes were checked, Smith's job was done. He didn't need more than that, and the movie never really tried hard enough to make him more than that. Never more and never less. Just there as a handsome, generic, carefully positioned vehicle for a story that was always about someone else. And that, more than anything, is why John Smith is an awfully bad generic character. I'm all done. Goodbye.